The roadmap to covering the DoDonPachi series on Bullet Heaven has been messy. We started with DoDonPachi in episode 6, hit up Resurrection way later down the line in episode 81, then immediately jumped on DaiOuJou literally as soon as it came out in the very next episode. DoDonPachi Resurrection was revisited on Steam complete with the Black Label and Ketsupachi arranged modes in episode 159, and finally, over 110 episodes after that, we landed on the original DoDonPachi for Sega Saturn. We've just about covered the entire breadth of a series that became true shooting royalty. Nearly. We know what's missing. You know what's missing. So let's get into it. Sort of.
Okay, good luck.
DoDonPachi DaiOuJou, also known as Blissful Death, was originally released to arcades in April 2002. It would see an excellent port to the PlayStation 2 from Marika in 2003, with a decidedly less good yet arguably more fun extra Black Label version released to the Xbox 360 in 2009 by 5PB. Outside of a rather commendable port for iOS, DaiOuJou never really saw a release outside of Japan. And this is none of those. It turns out, like many of Cave's games would end up, DoDonPachi DaiOuJou was also ported to cellular phones in Japan. But we're not talking about anything like a modern or even decade-old smartphone, nah. We're going old school with this one. This version of DoDonPachi was originally made for Java-based flip phones. And in a bizarre yet fascinating turn of events, this specific version has recently made it to the Nintendo Switch as part of the Gmode Archives Plus line of games in Japan. So, as a port of a super scaled down port of a rather highly regarded Cave game, is it even worth mentioning? Well, let's take a closer look. Java mobile games, especially those that aren't menu-driven or otherwise slower paced, have always been pretty jank. Frame rates, inputs, and visibility have always been the Java phone's Achilles heel when it came to mobile gaming back in the day. And we can definitely see these shortcomings here. And yet, DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX is remarkably faithful to its original source material. Starting the game, players have access to the Type A and Type B ships from the normal game. DaiOuJou never had a Type C craft, making it a unique series entry in that respect. Players then select one of 3 dolls, which will change how their chosen ship operates. Shotia emphasizes the player's main shots, with 3 bombs to start, while Lanyan features a more powerful laser and 2 bombers. Finally, Exi will boost everything but leaves the player with just 1 bomb. From there, players choose their starting stage and away they go. DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX features 8-way movement and 3 inputs. We can't really imagine playing a game like this using the approximation of a D-pad found on older cellular phones, but to the game's credit, its performance doesn't feel especially terrible here. It's absolutely no PlayStation 2 DaiOuJou, but it's serviceable. Like the real game, players can tap the shot button for a rapid-fire machine gun shot while holding it activates a laser attack and slows their ship's movement. The general choppiness to it all will make the difference in movement speed feel less evident, but it's definitely still there. A separate input is dedicated to rapid shots though. As with any other DoDonPachi game, the player will have access to a bomber stock to clear the screen in emergency situations or to chew through a boss much faster than regular fire alone. The default bomber will clear the screen with a big ol' explosion as expected. Meanwhile, deploying one with laser fire active will overdrive the laser, allowing for bullets in its path to be cleared while dealing superpowered damage in the process. Players will also be able to collect Hyper pickups to engage ridiculously powered shot and laser fire. Hyper is deployed in lieu of a bomber, allowing players to deal stupid damage while keeping their stock intact for reasons we'll talk about shortly. A Hyper will appear when the narrow pink gauge in the top left-hand corner of the screen is completely filled. This is tied primarily with the hit counter as players impact enemies with their shots, something that using a Hyper facilitates rather well, especially against bosses. Multiple Hypers can be picked up and stocked before use. Larger stocks will result in a longer, more powerful deployment. However, activating Hyper while a Hyper pickup is on screen will convert that Hyper pickup into a large bonus item instead. Played over the course of 5 stages, this version of DoDonPachi DaiOuJou is obviously very scaled back. In fact, there isn't very much about it that is especially deluxe. The play area is smaller, each stage is considerably shorter, the performance is choppy, and there is some very noticeable input delay regardless of the controller used. On its default setting, the game is also very easy. Only on hard and above are experienced players willing to stick with it going to find a considerable difficulty. Still, we have to admit, it plays a lot better than we expected a Java game to run, based on our own experiences with cell phone games around the time of its release. And while the games we got here in North America definitely paled by comparison to the ones Japan got over services like NTT Docomo, a Danmaku shooting game such as DoDonPachi was never a game we would have thought could work. For players looking for more, a code can be inputted at the game's title screen to unlock a boss rush and an extra special difficulty that ramps bullets way up. It's not especially fun. Without the original to play side by side though, there's no telling how much better or worse this version runs, or whether or not the emulation used accurately depicts how the game ran in 2005. Still, it's at least competent, and that's way more than we would have expected. The scoring system in DaiOuJou DX is actually fairly involved despite the game being as scaled back as it is. All of the scoring mechanics from the real game are represented here, which actually makes this game feel kind of robust from a score attack point of view. As with other DoDonPachi games we've played, outside of general enemy destruction, players are going to want to maintain a high hit counter in order to boost their scores as efficiently as possible. Whether it be through rapid, laser, or hyper fire, the higher the hit count, the better. The player's shot count will be maintained as long as the hit gauge on the left-hand side of the screen isn't empty. Star bonuses will also contribute score to the player's totals, as will the hidden bees scattered around each stage. Star bonuses are uncovered through regular fire, while bees can only be collected once they are hit with the leading segment of laser fire. As is the case with the original DaiOuJou, the higher the hit counter, the more these bee bonuses will be worth. Maximum score also makes a return. If the player collects another bomber pickup beyond their maximum allowed stock, maximum will appear in the bomber column, and the score will climb sharply as it does so. Using a bomb will interrupt maximum score until the stock exceeds maximum bombers again. Stage End will also grant the player with a significant point boost, tallying all the star bonuses the player has collected, as well as a sizable bonus for the boss hit count. Not only is using a hyper a very efficient way of killing most bosses, it's also a great way to pump up the boss hit counter in no time at all. One thing we did notice was a lack of a no-miss score, but this falls in line with the arcade version of DaiOuJou as well. The neatest part of this release has to be the implementation of online leaderboards for players to stack themselves up with others from around the world. However, any given run has the potential not to register, whether it be because the wrong button is pressed at game over or because the goddamn Wi-Fi has mysteriously cut out again. Switch. Come on. Thankfully, in the in-game option menu, players can select their difficulty and press Y to upload their scores if they fail to upload after game over. It's kinda bullshit, but it works. All things considered, this is a neat feature, and while this version of DaiOuJou is far from being the most ideal way of playing the game, it's nice to have at least some kind of modern leaderboard function. It won't really keep me coming back, but it might do the trick for some. Let's just get this out of the way here. DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX is not going to impress brand new players in the visual or sound departments at first glance. But we have to admit, as players with experience in the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 versions of the game, for the platform it's running on and the resolution it's been ported to, a lot of what makes DaiOuJou memorable does manage to translate over well enough. Obviously, file size limits are going to affect much of what's going on in the game. Less rich colors, drastically reduced animation, chunkier sprites, and much shorter stages mean that this version of the game will never look as good as even titles like DonPachi or DoDonPachi from the mid-90s. Still, what's here is good enough, especially when you consider that it would have been originally played on a screen less than 2 inches diagonally. Things are even less great in terms of sound, but again, there is enough resemblance to many of the original soundtracks from the arcade version in the G-mode version of the game. The catch here, once again, is that the tracks are very short compared to the originals. However, they also have that unmistakable, cheap, typical cell phone game style MIDI sampling that keeps it from being especially good. This goes doubly for the sound effects. While the bonus collection sound is accurate, and probably a significant part of the game's overall file size, the explosions are little more than a MIDI snare drum. I gotta be real, if I were in charge of sound design, I'd have swapped the item sample for better explosions, easy. Pressing the L button will cycle through low sound, high sound, and off. The in-game presentation is as bare bones as it comes, but the G-Mode switch wrapper is nice and clean with options for adding a cell phone bezel to the game area as well as a smoothing feature. Well, okay, it's nothing spectacular, but it does all it needs to do. The menus are all in Japanese though, so with no English option, players may need to bust out a translation app. By the way, that code we were talking about earlier, it can be found in the How to Play section. All you gotta do is press left, left, down, 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 left, 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 and boom, there it is. One quick thing to consider here as well is that DaiOuJou DX runs in a more or less 1-to-1 aspect ratio, making any sort of tate mode 100% useless for this version of the game. With a square play area, all players would end up doing is rotating the game with no change in size or screen real estate at all. I think we've seen all there is to see with this one, but how does it stack up? Let's take a look. The control in DaiOuJou DX is far from ideal, plagued with input delay and hindered by suboptimal game performance. DaiOuJou DX is actually a very tame version of an otherwise challenging arcade game, with an easy and normal 1cc more than possible for the average player. Most of the real challenge will come from mixing the less than good control with higher difficulties. DaiOuJou DX has a very short length compared to the arcade version thanks to its scaled back stages. We don't feel compelled to come back to this one. I think I hear the PlayStation 2 version calling out to me. Visually, DaiOuJou DX is surprisingly faithful to the original arcade release, but only just. Still, it's rather impressive for the kind of game it is. Meanwhile, the music is somewhat tolerable if severely truncated, and its two sound effects are half accurate, half trash. Shrinking DoDonPachi down to a Java mobile game seems like it'd be an impossible feat, and while this game is definitely less good than great, it's still impressive enough to warrant a look for fans of classic cave danmaku. At about 500 yen or so, or around $5, DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX should at least hold players' interest for a little while, but this is definitely not a long-haul shooting game. We'd say, if you like this one, definitely invest in the PlayStation 2 or Xbox 360 releases. With that said, its value is good enough. Look, there's no nice way to say it, this game is kinda shit, but it also makes for a fascinating look at the kinds of extreme ports that were considered for mobile distribution in what is now a bygone era. Wait, is it a bygone era these days? Surely it is. Or is it? Nah, it is. Granted, it's nowhere near what we'd expect of even a PS2 era cave game, but for its surprisingly faithful spirit, DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX still manages to squeeze out a 3 out of 5. You can get DoDonPachi DaiOuJou DX on the Japanese eShop for around 500 yen or about $5. As of this review, there is no Western release planned. You know what this means, we're gonna have to do a full episode on the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 versions of DaiOuJou now. I think by law it's illegal not to at this point, or something, whatever. Coming up next, a game that filled a void left by shooting royalty, until R-Type Final 2, finally hit the scene. Rigid Force is coming up next on Bullet Heaven. In the meantime, be sure to like, subscribe, hit the bell, and share our channel. It helps a lot. See you all in the next episode.